Well, hello, fellas.
Hello.
Good morning.
It's nice to have you guys here. We have my brother, my older brother, Jeff McBride, who's 2.5 years older than I am. And it'd be interesting to compare you two because I think you come from almost opposite ends of the spectrum, which is fascinating to me. What a cool thing God has done to bring you guys together. But I'll intro my brother less, not because he's less important. Well, maybe Mike would say that. But Jeff was actually at Dallas Theological Seminary at the time, and to get through school, he was collecting ID cards at the YMCA down in Dallas Fort Worth area, and ended up finishing seminary, but then basically not going the pastoral route, not the traditional pastoral route, and worked his way through basically literally every job from the swimming pool to the weight room to every single thing. Worked his way up, eventually became a director. Eventually they gave him his own Y, which was this kind of, it was cool. It was like a ranch Y. It was like a retreat center. And then he ended up getting property donated and raised money and built this Y. So he was essentially, I think you were essentially like a CEO of these two Ys that you ran, right?
As an executive director.
Executive director. And then that basically led to him becoming the CEO of the YMCA for Orange County. And it's grown a lot, Jeff. I don't know, you went from what revenue, what number of employees to what now today?
We were 25 million when I got here. We pre-COVID we're 50 million. We'll be there pretty quickly again. Went from a little less than 800 staff to 1,500.
Yeah, so big.
Went from I think 8 months from bankruptcy to we're in good shape.
Yeah,
Say
that's
that.
super cool. And that's 14 years ago, right?
That's correct.
14 years. And Jeff lives in Mission Viejo with my awesome sister-in-law, Lori. And then in the other corner, we have Mike Proud, who, so Jeff has this pastoral, even seminary trained bent, but then he went the business route the whole time. And Mike, you are the chairman of the board of the YMCA of Orange County, and you have been since 2018, I think. But
No, since 21.
Since 2020. Okay, 2020.
2021.
Okay.
I've been on the board since 18.
Been on the board since 18. So you're new to the chairmanship. Yeah. But you've been a pastor your whole life. You were a youth pastor. You were an associate pastor for 7 years. You were a senior pastor for 18 years and 3 churches in 3 different states: Missouri, Colorado, and California. 10 years as a CEO of Southern Baptist Association, kind of missions-oriented place. And so now this is kind of neat. You join this more business-oriented person with this more pastoral person together. Jeff has pastoral gifts. I've always felt like that. And you clearly have business acumen and business gifts. So I think it's neat because you're both a little imbalanced probably on each side. And like a good marriage, I think God is probably using that, right? I read an excerpt. So first of all, thank you so much for spending the time to do this with me. You're being piped into our live message right now to our church, and also will be recorded on our website for a sermon that I've done on 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 3 through 12 on this idea of being born again. I read an excerpt from a commentary by a guy that I really do like a lot, and I read him a lot. His name is Scott McKnight. And I was reading along, and he was talking about the passage that we're studying this morning. And he had this statement, and of course, my eyes popped because I saw the letters YMCA. And if I see the letters YMCA, or if I hear the term YMCA, my ears just perk up. If somebody says, oh yeah, I belong to the YMCA, it means a lot more to me because, my brother Jeff that I love so much, and I know how invested he has been. And it was funny when I was studying this passage, when I read this excerpt, the author said, which I believe to be a very, very true statement, that the Ys around the country. And Jeff, I don't remember when YMCA started. Do you know how long it's been?
It started in London in 1844. It was a Bible study. It was actually a Bible study.
A Bible study. And do you know when it came to the States?
Mike, do you have that number?
I don't know.
It's been here 150 years ago. So wow. It's been around a long time.
So he said that at one time the YMCA's were this godly salvation message oriented organization that has now, quote unquote, succumbed to the spirit of social services, so much so that most of us could be forgiven if we ask why the letter C remains on the sign. What's your reaction to that?
Are you asking me or Mike? That's not a surprise. I mean, I've been in an organization for a long time, and as you mentioned, I got this job working at the front desk to put myself through seminary. So I've long known the Y to be a secular organization, from Christian roots and a Christian foundation, but it's much more secular and much more social based, and it seems to chase the latest cultural hot item of the day, and that changes. The emails I get, it changes almost weekly, especially nowadays. It's
so even though you're running kind of your own fiefdom, if you will, in Orange County, you're still kind of in the overall bubble. So you're still interacting with CEOs and different Ys around the country and see how that still is moving.
To a degree, and we can talk about my interaction nationally. It's been restricted to a degree because of some of the decisions I've made. Christianity is certainly part of our foundation, but it's not something that we espouse much anymore, and it's not something we promote by any means, unless the person you're trying to ask money from is a Christian, and then Jesus's name is brought out pretty readily, and then put back into a little box.
You mean nationally?
Yes, and I was with the Dallas Y for a little over 12 years, and Houston Y a little over 12 years, and they're probably a little more Christ-centered because of the location in the South, but still, it really is. I mean, Jesus is more of leverage for opportunity than he is for a foundational principle on how we. And people might disagree with me, but I've struggled with it. It was a struggle. It's been a struggle in my career until the last few years as to where Christ is in the Y and what's my place in the Y. It was hard.
So 14 years ago, when you started, Jeff, in your employee handbook of all things, which I can't believe you did this, because I came out of the corporate world before Brian Fury and I started our own company. But in all places in your employee handbook, in the welcome from the president and CEO, you had said some very specific things. I've asked you to pull it. Can you just read a couple of those things that you basically said to the entire organization when you started?
Yeah, and I think I wrote this in my first few weeks since I arrived. And it says, "Welcome to the YMCA Orange County. When I arrived in Orange County in September of 2007, I made a commitment to the Lord." Sorry, I'll get a little emotional.
Yeah.
As a Christian, I have learned that even as a flawed man, I am loved completely by a perfect God. Though I have made many mistakes and I didn't deserve it, I was always forgiven, accepted, and loved unconditionally. This experience has resulted in a man who humbly wants to serve his Savior as an act of gratitude for that which he has been given. Although not all employees may share the same conviction of faith, all are welcome at this YMCA. If you have a desire to serve, grow professionally and personally, the YMCA is the place for you. Our tagline of "We build strong kids, strong families, strong communities" applies as much to our employees as our members.
That's just... Tell me about that. I mean, what was your goal when you started 14 years ago and when you wrote that? And just in general, it goes back to this thing. You were like, okay, I'm going to put the C back in YMCA. So what?
Gosh, there's a lot behind it, but I think I did mention it a couple minutes ago. I've been with the Y for 20 years at that point, or a little over 20 years, and I'd seen a lot of hypocrisy and things that I struggled with. And it doesn't matter if it's your marriage or I mean, there's not a person that's probably listening that doesn't work in an organization. If leadership is acting out of self-interest, you see the hypocrisy. I mean, everybody feels it. You can't hide it. You're the recipient of it, and you know that they're self-serving, and you're a cog by which they are served, or they accomplish their stuff. And there's nobody that doesn't understand that or feel it. And I felt that for 20 plus years. And I struggled with it, and I probably didn't handle it really well, but I struggled with it because as a believer, they were espousing something but weren't living it. And that is a weird deal because it's kind of like, I guess, it's from a secular sense, we're going to espouse Christian principles, quote unquote, but we weren't living them. And that's a really hard thing to handle. And I've never been one, and you know that, to be kind of quiet. So I would stand up and challenge things quite a bit. But it was always about self-protection, self-aggrandizement, and self. And it always comes down to thy will be done or my will be done. And so when I came here, and I've done it everywhere I've been, I kneeled down and I said, God, this is yours. And this place has never been about me, and it never will be about me. It can't be, because I think I would limit the effectiveness of what can be done if it's about me. I'm a sinner. So my biggest thing is I wanted to do it right. I wanted to do it right. We all say that, but I don't get to that part.
So that's a perfect lead into what I want to ask next. So in this series, and I've mentioned this to you guys before we did this, but I've spoken a lot, particularly in this particular sermon, about this balance that comes, that I think we need to bring to the outside world, right? And that as followers of Jesus, we're not called to assimilate to the world. We're not supposed to look anything like the world. We are, what I preached on a couple weeks ago, we are resident aliens. We are citizens of heaven. This is not our world. We're supposed to not assimilate. But the flip side is also true. We're not supposed to attack. Unfortunately, those are often the two responses I think that the church has, and it's a huge mistake because we either, especially now, the culture is so belligerent and so aggressive and so, quite frankly, intolerant with their tolerance that we cower and are afraid to speak, right? We need to become like the blind guy that said, you can say whatever you want. Here's the deal. I couldn't see 2 minutes ago. Now I can see. So you explain it to me. I don't know. It's, or we attack, which is the other side of what I think we do. In that case, we look like the world. That's what the world's doing. So how are we any different? Posting all these belligerent, cantankerous things, and I'm going to take a stand for Jesus, no matter how disrespectful and dishonoring it will be to you. And we fight for what we think, and we fight for our rights. And I don't think either one is good. And so it's interesting. So you took that stance, but you also said, look, this may not fit you. You know what I mean? And you weren't espousing that. So what are your thoughts on this? The not assimilating, not attacking, and how you conduct yourself in your positions, both Jeff, you as the CEO, and Mike, you as the chairman of the board.
Mike, you want to start? Or you want me to start? Or?
Well, first of all, from my experience, so Jeff's been in the YMCA over 30 years collectively. And I came connected in 2012. And part of my role, what I do now, working with 145 churches, is help church planters get connected, help them find places to meet, help them get their, government tax stuff all put together, get their EIN numbers, all that. So when I first connected with the YMCA, it was to meet Jeff because he's the CEO of the Orange County YMCA, and to talk with him about this idea of how can churches partner with the Y, because there's a Christian heritage there. And so Jeff shared with me his faith journey and his desire to see the C elevated. But then the more I got to investigating all of this, I discovered that it was confusing to me because I come out of the church world for 35 years. It's like, okay, we're Christian. This is what it means to be Christian, and we're going to move forward. And the Y, even though it had the C in its name, that wasn't its perspective. So it's come to a place, this is at least my understanding, it's come to a place of, Jesus loved people. He was most critical on the religious leaders because they should have known better. They were doing things that they should have known better about. And lost people act like lost people. Right? So we expect that. You're lost, you act like lost people.
I would challenge that. Do we actually expect it? Why do we act so shocked every time then?
Right. Well, we should.
And so critical and judgmental. You know what I mean?
I think that's part of the perspective shift that we should have. that we should expect lost people to act like lost people, not be shocked and not think that they should live Christian standards. So I think some of that, not pushing back, not fighting on my rights, is that understanding that as a person who has been redeemed, part of my purpose is to live as a citizen of heaven here on earth, to show by example, what does it mean to be a Christian? And that's, I think, where that distinctiveness comes that you were talking about. I don't push back because that's what the world does, or I don't fight back because that's what the world does. What I do is I take a stand, and I make a stand in the way that I live, in the way that I love the people that are even bringing pain and attacking my positions or those things that I hold as value. And Ephesians 6:12 reminds me that they're not the enemy, that we don't battle against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities of the air. And so I think that helps to shape that understanding of, okay, how am I supposed to engage when people are hateful? How am I supposed to engage when people are attacking those things that are of value to me? And so we even, on the board at the YMCA, I mean, we have people that are not believers that are on the YMCA. And some of the struggle is, okay, this is a Christian organization or it's not a Christian organization. And if it's a Christian organization, then everybody is welcome, but not everybody gets to drive the bus, right? Not everybody's making decisions for the direction we're going. And it's really very similar to the church. The church is a Christian organization. It is there to be a hospital for sick people spiritually. Okay, so everybody's welcome. It doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter your preferences. It doesn't matter what you want to be called. It doesn't matter any of those things. But not all those people get to make the decisions for the direction of the church. They're all welcome. They're all loved. They're all cared for. But the church still needs to maintain its focus.
That's awesome.
Well, and what's been really interesting too is when I came. Lord willing, I hope I've grown a lot. But when I came with some anger because I saw the hypocrisy of the leadership where I had previously been. And so I came, and I don't know that I had the right mindset. When I first started, I was sharing with Mike earlier. I mean, we'd go into a meeting, we'd pray. And of course, people are going to do it because I'm the CEO. And it took me a few weeks to realize, I'm kind of cramming stuff down people's throats. And you go on this journey, and I had to really rework a lot of my thinking. And I know a pivotal watershed moment for me, and this is going to sound very simplistic, but it was so true. I had to adjust and realize the Y is not a Christian organization. And even though I've been in it almost 20 years, I hadn't accepted that. And so I was like, do I even stay? And the biggest pivot point was when God clearly said to me, Jeff, this is your ministry field. I mean, you're expecting these people, and you mentioned it earlier, these are sinners. They're going to act like sinners, but you're expecting them to be Christians. And you have to accept and adjust that you are not in a Christian organization. And then these people are hurting, and they are, I have 1,500 people that I can minister to and show them Christ's love and grace and forgiveness, my decisions and in my treatment of them. And my commitment on a lot of things. I don't compromise on a lot of stuff. And all that stuff is part of the role you play as a CEO. And
so that's a good lead into where I want to go next then, because this doesn't always work. Following Jesus, it doesn't always work. And you know what I mean by that. Peter said this in 1 Peter 4:12. He said, "Beloved, do not be surprised." It means shocked. Don't be shocked at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though some strange thing were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, that's the point. Not insulted because you're a belligerent jerk. If you're, back to your point, Mike, if you're insulted because you're loving and living well, in the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and God rests upon you. And Peter goes on to describe Jesus as both the cornerstone, the chief cornerstone to build your entire building on, and that same cornerstone is the rock of offense, right? And I know Jeff won't use the word suffering for Christ because he's too humble to say that. So Mike, I'm gonna push it to you. Jeff can fill in, but we do suffer for Christ when we walk well and follow him. It doesn't always work. And
Right.
so can you give me an idea of how it hasn't, and you know what I mean by not worked? It's not It's not that you're not advancing the gospel. Not everybody likes it.
Right. So one of the things that, Jeff has said a number of times as it relates to the YMCA has been, his goal was to make the YMCA the best place to work in Orange County and to, make it a place that's profitable. And so he said a number of times, he goes, now, who could disagree with that? Who could ever disagree with that, right? Even from a worldly perspective, who could disagree with this being the best place to work in all of Orange County and to be a place with a good, solid bottom line? But the reality is, because of the way in which that he has lived as being a person who says, I'm a believer, he puts it out there, the way that decisions are made, very biblical in their foundation. And yet, because of his stand, I mean, he can tell you the number of times that he has been named in lawsuits because someone in the organization felt like they were being discriminated against because they weren't a Christian, or because they were being discriminated against because of a particular sexual orientation that was, against a Christian value, or different things like that. And there have been numerous examples of those kinds of things that it works. So Jeff will tell you it works because his role is just to be obedient to the Lord and trust God with the results. The reality is, for people who experience, being named in a lawsuit's a scary thing. And it's a difficult thing. And you do sometimes lose sleep over those. And he's experienced all of that. And I think those are the kinds of hardships, as we define trials, those are the kind of things that refine that he's been through that maybe he wouldn't talk about himself. But no,
I think you're giving me too much credit, but yeah, it's hard to explain it. The world's really interesting, and people don't want to necessarily, they don't have a walk with the Lord. So when the Lord convicts me of my sin or my shortcomings, I can't say, no, it's not true. I can go on, but the reality is, in a business setting, and Doug, you've experienced this, and I know, when people have not necessarily performed appropriately in their jobs or whatever, and they are held to account, and through all the proper channels, some people simply refuse to admit they're wrong, which is, that's just part of the price. So I have, being named in a lawsuit, I can't, it's countless numbers of lawsuits. When I first came, that scared the heck out of me. 15 years later or 14 years later, it doesn't. But I remember during a 1 year period, I was under investigation, an internal investigation, and we had to hire an external investigator. I was investigated about 10 months out of 12. We spent $500,000 trying to get through all this stuff. And we had some board members who wanted them to find bad things because they, I can't kind of get in people's minds, but I think it's because they wanted more to control the organization that we had built. And very, very painful, and people turned on one another, and it was a mess. But a lot of really amazing things happened. The organization cleaned itself, and I was absolved of everything. But I've been accused of everything you can be accused of, except for sexual harassment, racial discrimination, religious discrimination, theft and fraud and embezzlement, and it's all been out there. But that's the price you pay, and my Christianity has been really interesting. You see it in the world, is a convenient way to attack me. Of course, I have to be a bias against a homosexual. Of course I do. of course I mean, it's super convenient, and so you end up having to defend yourself, which is the price you pay. But at the same time, it's what an honor. And this is only after years of experience and going through it. At the time you had asked me, it wasn't an honor, but
Right.
having gone through it and seen the work that God has done in the organization and in me was miraculous. And I'm a different person.
And the key, I think, is because if you know in your conscience, to Mike's point, you've lived well and loved well, there's nothing
Yes.
more you can do. And so
Right.
Jesus, you can't do it any better than he did it. And he got nailed to a cross for it. So it's not like you're not
Right.
going to follow suit. But let me ask one final question. And this is kind of flipping that around then. And I just want a practical one or two things where it did work. And again, we're not after results. That's not we're called to be faithful. Not the results are not our problem. But there are times where we see the gospel actually advancing with people. And I'm going to throw the first example out because you both shared it with me because I think it is just fascinating. It's like subterfuge. It's like you guys have had a calculated way of bringing the gospel in without people even knowing it. You've got these like 4 principles. It's really based on one principle, and then you have these other principles that hang off of that. And so, like, even as practical as when you come into a meeting, you run the meeting based on this principle. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really been interesting. And just to back up, and if you would bear with me for like 3 minutes, just to give you a little background, I've always processed information, and because we grew up with amazing parents, and we've always had a relationship with the Lord. I grew up with an inherent process by which we make decisions, which we'll get to in a second. But I didn't realize that wasn't the standard of how people make decisions. So it was kind of innate with me, but I didn't think it through. And so I struggled with a lot of my staff, and my COO now, she was my chief development officer, came in my office about 3 years ago, very frustrated, and was looking to work elsewhere, and she couldn't find other work. So now she's desperate because she's got a pretty good job and she can't get work elsewhere. And so she's like, okay, I got to talk to him. So she came into this office and she said, I just don't get it. I don't get how you think. And she's so frustrated. And I was able to sit down and diagram and explain how I make decisions, which we'll get to in a sec. And she stood up and said, no one thinks like this. And that was it. And it has nothing to do with me. It was such an eye-opening thing. And I realized where I had failed utterly. And that is, I wasn't communicating. We were talking, but we were never really communicating. And so with Mike's help, we've started to capture some of the principles, but they're all biblical, but we put them. So it starts with, and I think the most important one, without question, is from Romans 3:23, 5:23. I'm a sinner. We don't write that. So I say I'm flawed. I am, and I'm flawed. I don't have to have all the answers because I can't have all the answers. And I've never understood that concept. And I've talked to many CEOs. They have all this pressure because they always have to have the answers. I don't have any pressure. I don't have to have the answers because I can't have the answers. It's inherently impossible. I accept that I'm a sinner. And that foundational principle is how the entire organization is.
And your subterfuge is you use the word flawed. You're very calculated in how you do it. So you're not assimilating, but you're also taking a stance. And there is no more core basic thing to come to Christ than to realize we are flawed, broken people.
And Doug,
Exactly.
I think one of the principles in that is that when you use words like sin, sinner, that you build walls. But if you use a word like flawed, then everybody will listen because they all understand that principle to be true. None of us, you hear the expression, I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect, right? You hear that said all the time. Well, this communicates that in a way that people will at least receive the principle and let that sink in and marinate in them.
And you guys structure your meetings this way. People come into a meeting,
Absolutely.
and the basic principle is everybody in the room is flawed. Nobody knows the exact truth. Nobody has cornered the truth, and so we all need to come together to find out what is. Which also has the basic premise: there is a truth sitting there. There is,
Right.
And the world tells us two things: you're not flawed. You're just beautiful, perfect the way you are,
Yeah.
which I think is just hilarious. And second of all, there is no absolute truth. And Why?
And here's why it's really relevant, especially for my position or potentially yours or Mike's. When I have an idea, I'm the CEO. If I have an idea, what people hear is we have to go into this meeting and figure out how to make his idea work. Because the foundational principle is my idea has to be the right one. Right. My idea, or a staff person's, but in particular, my idea is only the beginning of a conversation. Our conversations might say that's the worst idea in the history of mankind. Right. But we have to start with I'm flawed just like them, and nobody gets to clarity. That's another principle. Nobody gets to clarity alone. I can sit here and come up with the most incredible ideas by myself and tell me how great I am, and then you go out there, it doesn't work at all. But if you are isolated, so we test everything, and we all have.
I think the beauty behind that is that's also a godly principle. So you're bringing the gospel up because it requires community, right? I mean, we need community. We can't live. And again, a basic premise of the world right now is full, flat out isolation. The average American has gone from 3 friends to less than 1. Less than 1. I mean, that's just like. So this is. I wanted this to come up because it's just not a massive thing. You just took some basic principles of Jesus and you wove them into your daily practice in your company, and you're actually advancing the understanding of humanity within them and the understanding of the gospel by doing that. I just think it's just beautiful.
Well, it's the hardest thing that people struggle with, and I think your members would understand. If you're in a business setting, the amount of time people spend trying to say the right thing or to be perceived as being on the right team or whatever, it's just such a waste of energy, emotional energy. We literally are all the same when we walk in the room. We all have, there's no hierarchy when we're in the room, because truth is truth. We're all submitted to that. Right. We call it holding up a mirror. We all accept that we have blind spots, and that everybody's a believer, but we all accept we are flawed and we have blind spots. So when Doug does his stuff that he always does, we say, Doug, you're doing your stuff. And Doug says, okay, because he's safe. He's totally safe in this environment.
Which is also another godly principle, which is
absolutely
there is a higher authority, by the way.
Yes.
We all, which is not popular today. So again, this is super cool. I just love this. It's such an easy, practical way to follow Christ in our day-to-day workplace, jobs, without attacking, without assimilating.
Yeah, and the last piece, and then we'll talk about the scripture part, which Mike is helping me with, because we're going to write. This is all going to be written out, and we're going to have the rest of the story. It'll be an appendix. It'll be all the scripture behind all this stuff. So it'll be a secular workbook for training for my staff, and then the last chapter, if they so choose, we'll find out where it all comes from. So it's going to be interesting. So we're excited to do that. But the last piece, which is super important, and it's where I think growth comes from, is the fourth principle is your role. And sounds really trite, but your role dictates your responsibility. And it sounds like it's obvious, but it's really, really difficult. So the CEO role, or as a husband, or as a father, or as a pastor, I'm submitted to that role. God has put me in that position to steward this organization. Jeff, he's out the window. The CEO has a calling from the Lord to do the right thing. And that could be in big things or small things, but you're called to do the right thing. What's the CEO supposed to do? And as a group, we help determine what that is. And often, and this is where God is amazing to me. And it's one of the most, it's been one of the most important parts of my journey. The CEO role would dictate my action or lack of action or whatever I had to do. Often, the human was so scared, I didn't want to do it. And I'll give you 2 really benign illustrations. You talk about lawyers. The 2 things I came into this job probably inherently probably scared more than anything else was being sued and having to deal with lawyers. And the other one was dealing with the media. Because we work with thousands of kids all the time. And if something bad happens, the media descends. And I'm not a big fan of the media at times because I don't know what you're going to get. So it was just really scary. So when it comes to the legal aspect, let's just talk about media. When COVID hit, we had a whole lot of opportunity for media to come in because we did a lot of really amazing. I mean, our staff were amazing, but they asked to be interviewed and talk, and on a bunch of news stations. Doug, I didn't want to do it. It's like it's like the last thing that I wanted to do. I was scared. No one knows that because you can never show you're scared. But I was scared. I didn't want to do it. But my role demanded it be me. Now, I could have legitimately handed it off to my communications person. That's their job. No one would know, and I can legitimately do it. But we knew my role dictated that I'm the one in front of the camera. And this is what's amazing about God's plan. Because my role dictates my responsibility, I had to do the very thing that I didn't want to do, but that my job and my role demanded. So now I'm on TV and I do it once, twice, 5, 7, 10 times. And all of a sudden, it's not so bad. And I've grown, and then I became pretty proficient at it, and then I didn't mind. But if I didn't do what I had to do, I wouldn't have personally grown, if that makes any sense. So the role demands me having to confront. The role demands me having to do things that the human being freaks out about, but I have to lean into it. And that's where the growth has come. And God has called us to stand up in a gracious and loving way that we often have a lot of excuses not to do it. But that's where our growth comes from. And I've made mistakes in how you do it, but you continue to grow. And that's where I'm really grateful. So, and last little piece, and this is probably benign, but this is a small aside. My role as a husband is dictated the same way. And I remember years ago, I just felt like, I need to bring my wife flowers. What the husband should do is bring the wife flowers. It's just a small thing. So I'd always stop. I won't say the place in case Lori ever finds out, because she always asks me where I get them. But I just said, I'm going to bring her flowers every month or two. I'm just going to stop and get them. And I promise you, for 6, 8, 10 months, I never wanted to stop. I never once thought, yeah, I get to stop. I'm tired. I've worked all day. I got 15 reasons why I shouldn't stop. But the role dictated as a husband, I'm stopping for the flowers. 10 years later, I'm happy to stop for the flowers. But it's a fight. It's an internal struggle because my role says that's what you got to do. But then the great reception and the benefit and the blessing that has been for her, then it becomes easier. But you have to, it's an act of the will to follow the stewardship that God's given you. And I'll be quiet now, but that's part of the role of CEO too. It's or whatever role you have.
Or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And that's can I
go ahead.
Share just one thought, because you had asked in this, give an example of how this has worked out. So one of the things I think that, as a believer, always looking for the opportunities that God gives us to testify for him or to love people as he's called us to do it, there are times when interacting with folks when they know that you are a believer and may not agree with your position, may not agree with your values or anything like that. But one of the things that I've found has always been a benefit is staying connected with those people, loving on those people, because in the moment when crisis comes in their life, in the moment when they're hurting, is a time when you have the opportunity to really testify then about why you have what the peace that you have, or why you are doing the things that you're doing. And so not offering any names, but there was a woman who is a part of the Y as an employee who, she was just struggling in her life. She was trying to get things figured out. She didn't know why she was struggling so much with making decisions or with the different things. And it gave me the opportunity to sit down with her and hear that she had a Christian journey. But in her mind, she would have called herself a believer. But the reality is that, she got dunked in some water. She joined a church. Her name was on a roll, and that was it. But there was no relationship. And so I had the chance to share with her what relationship was, and actually come to find out that, she said, well, I guess I'm not a Christian. I said, well, you want me to tell you how that can happen? and got to share Christ with her, got to share the gospel with her, and watch her give her life over to the Lord in that moment. But had we not been in the field, had we not just in our words, but in our actions, let people know that we were Christ followers, that opportunity may never have come up.
Because it goes back to what you said. You live well, right?
Yep.
You love well over a
Yep.
long period of time,
Yeah.
and you stand ready to give an answer.
That's right. And because that time will come. But if we withdraw, if we fight back, then we become enemies of those other people where they want nothing to do with us.
That's awesome. You guys, I cannot thank you enough for this time. This has just been unbelievable. So appreciative. And our church thanks you on behalf of Christ.
Amen.
God bless. Thanks, y'all.
God
Love you,
bless
Doug.
you guys. Love you too, man.